Hello everybody, welcome to another video on Middlegames. This game focuses on Middlegames resulting from the French defence. So for this sample game I have for you, it is Anand versus Mariotti from 1988. Anand was white and the Tarrasch version of the French was played, which is when white plays knight d2 and knight f6. So in this game, e5, which is the main move, and knight d7 is a move I've seen more often, but this is also perfectly fine, knight e4. And white could take, but then the black pawn, which would recapture and be on e4, is sometimes called a splinter in White's camp, because it's very hard for White to develop the pieces onto the light squares because he can't put the knight to f3 or the bishop to d3, which are natural squares in the French, and it's harder than you think to actually take that pawn. So Anand instead plays bishop d3, and his opponent then immediately played f5. So the idea here is to cement the knight's position on e4 and create pressure against white immediately. But Anand played pawn takes en passant, and here, if black doesn't recapture with the knight, white can then take it or even play queen h5 check, very nasty. So knight takes, and after knight g to f3, what we notice about this position is that black has a backward pawn on e6. So the main fight in this middle game is going to be over the e5 square, which is quite common in the French. Black is going to try and push the pawn to e5, getting it to catch up with its friend on d5. And white is going to try and use e5 for his pieces and prevent black pushing the pawn. Bishop d6, castles, castles, rook e1, again more pressure on the e-file, c5. So what black is aiming to do is to remove the pawn's control of e5. And you would expect white to play c3, reinforcing the d4 pawn. But Anand didn't do that. He actually played takes, and after the bishop took, knight d to b3. So here what's happened is black has been left with hanging pawns, and that isn't quite true actually. Hanging pawns are normally referred to as two pawns that are side by side, and the problem with them is that they can be targets for attack. And if one pawn advances, then the pawn that's left behind becomes very weak. So here it's almost like black has had hanging pawns and then pushed one of them to d5. So the e pawn is still very, very weak, still a backward pawn. So the bishop moves back, and white can now use d4 as well as e5 to put the pieces onto. So knight b to d4, knight c6. So here, perhaps if bishop takes d4, knight takes d4, then perhaps e5 could be played to sacrifice the pawn. But c3 is played, so any capture with the on the knight on d4, white can recapture with the pawn. Queen d6. So now black has two pieces on e5 and might be able to push the pawn next move. But again, Anand does stop this with quite a tactical maneuver, bishop e3. So it now looks like it's easy to push the pawn. But white has a very strong response. Knight takes c6, pawn takes, and here white can simply play knight takes e5. because if black recaptures, then bishop takes b6, and that's created a discovered attack on the black queen. And after, say, queen d6, white can play the bishop back to d4, and also white has the two bishops, which could be a very useful endgame advantage. So Mariotti doesn't play e5. Instead, knight takes d4. And here, if pawn takes d4, then the bishop on e3 looks a little bit useless. It looks like just a big pawn, creating a pawn chain from f2 to d4. So bishop takes is played. It's more active. And black then recaptures, and white recaptures. So now e5 is definitely under control. The pawn, the knight, and the rook are all controlling e5. Job done. So this is just like an isolated pawn. You control the square in front of it and blockade. Now all we need to do is maneuver the pieces, if we were white, so that we could then we've paralyzed the pawn so it can't move forward. So we maneuver so that we can capture the pawn on e6. So white defends b2 first and connects the rooks. Here, queen takes d4 would again be very embarrassing. Can you see why? Yeah, bishop takes h7 check. And now after the bishop's taken, white wins the queen for a piece. So white should win quite easily here, being 6 points ahead. Bishop e8 is played. Rook ac1, so putting the rooks on good squares. Knight d7. So I think what black realizes here is that the bishop on e8 is a bad bishop. It's only going to be useful as a defender rather than an attacker. And white's rooks are superior to black's rooks. And white's knight is superior to black's knight. So I think the queens are about even. So I think what black wants to do is to swap off pieces so that perhaps in the king and pawn endgame he might be able to survive, as he could perhaps push the pawn to e5 and be able to equalize, because he could play king f7 and king f6, e5. So anyway, the exchange of pieces helps black, so white doesn't do that. And the pawn still can't push on to e5. Rook f6 is now used to defend the pawn. a4. So a4 looks like a strange move, but once you see the reason for it, it looks very logical. The queen on b6 is actually quite a useful piece, and I think Anand noticed that the queen doesn't have a lot of squares. So if you can push a5, the queen might have to go all the way back to d8. But bishop h5 is played first to attempt to trade off bishop for knight. a5 is thrown in. And yes, the queen goes to d8 to reroute. It also keeps an eye on the a5 pawn as well. So now Anand chose to play knight e5, and black took quickly. How would you recapture? Yeah, when there's a weak backward pawn, you don't block it up with pawns, you block it with pieces. So if you play d takes, black would actually have a protected passed pawn here on d5. So white's advantage in pawn structure would practically vanish. So instead, rook takes e5 was played, bishop g6, and Anand thinks that it's better not to trade bishops yet. His bishop's more useful attacking the pawns than black's is defending them. Bishop e2, rook c8, bishop g4. So this middle game's been all about attacking the e6 pawn and blockading it. And here, after rook takes rook, queen takes rook, it's incredibly difficult to protect that pawn. Can you see the problem with queen takes a5 though? Yeah, actually there's a checkmate in I think about 8 or 9 moves here. Queen c8, and if rook f8, bishop takes e6 check, and if the king moves, then queen takes rook mate. So if the bishop moves in front, can you see the mate in 2 here? Yeah, bishop takes bishop. So if the king moves away, the queen takes the rook mate again. And if the king recaptures, then queen e6 checkmate. So queen takes a5 isn't possible. Instead, bishop f5 was played, and Anand captured because he saw he was winning the game here. If e takes, it wasn't played in the game, but if e takes f5, then white can first just make sure there's no back rank mates, and black could trade off pawns. But then queen e3 threatens rook e8 check, winning the queen. And now queen f3 is attacking both d5 and f5, so black will end up losing a pawn here. Going back though, instead rook takes f5 was played, and finally rook takes e6, queen takes a5, check, check, and now white does eventually win the pawn with queen takes b7. And now I'll stop the video here because it now goes into a very long, complex queen and pawn endgame. But white's used all that pressure against e6 to eventually win a pawn and transition into this winning but very tricky endgame. So I hope that helped you in your middle game play if you do play the French or similar openings. Comment, like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!